Well, I'm sure that Matt Canavan will well and truly sign any part that he'd like of your body. Feel free, just turn up and see what happens. Double check with his missus first, but still. You can see him as, of course, the Senator from Queensland. And Nicholas Rees, he'll be there at Council if you'd like to get any pledges signed, as well as the Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Honestly, Nicholas, you've been around the game for a while, but when the former Labor staffer becomes the reporter, you couldn't hope for a better plant. I mean, his mobile phone didn't work when the boats were arriving in Western Australia, but, oh, here's a texter I had. Just conveniently. Would you please present your arm to me?
Oh, come on, Paul. You know, political journalists and politicians sort of move around across the media into political offices. I don't think there's anything untoward about that.
I'm just not entirely sure that somebody who had been previously described as advocating for a certain government should be reporting on said government, let alone providing them moments like this. But of course, if it was, was anyone to do with, this company, we know there'd be, calls for a royal commission. But when it's, of course, the Labor Party, it's just business as you were. But Matt, let's get to this big car ban. All right, now. The reality is, as we've shown before, when Australians have the choice of what they want to buy, they can buy a Tesla, they can buy a Leaf, but guess what? They're buying Hiluxes and they're buying big Utes at a 2-to-1 ratio over the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th place cars. Bowen's out there BSing about trying to pretend that it's all about, oh, no cars will end up being banned. Well, they will, because the manufacturer will be forced into what they can offer you. So it is a ban. So I'm not going to use their terminology. It's his attempt to change the rules about what you can drive. I know this, it's 101, and I'm not using their long definition of things. I'm using what normal people will see this as.
Well, Paul, you're absolutely right, because his own officials, the Minister's own officials last week in Senate estimates, told me that the intent of this scheme is to adjust the cars that manufacturers sell. So that's exact words, adjust the cars that are sold. Now, if you're adjusting the cars that are sold, you're of course adjusting the cars that you can buy as well. And you can't buy a new car unless someone is selling it to you. And that's exactly what this scheme is all about. These people don't like the fact that Australians like to buy Utes, and for other large vehicles, I get a little bit sick about that. That's a cultural thing, I think, ultimately, and they're quite happy to see people, Australians, who have those choices punished through this scheme. I've done my own sums, like the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. I did those in Senate estimates last week. It's not that hard to do, and there's these changes are going to have thousands of dollars of impact. The government keeps pointing to the United States, but in the US in the last 5 years, they've only cut their emission limits by 25%. We are planning to do 60% in the next 5 years, more than double what the US has done. The fines for contravening the limits in the US are a third, or have been a third, I should say, of what the government plans to do in the next 5 years. And so their US comparison is completely bunk. Well, we're now being told by the same guy who said he'd cut your power bills by $275 that putting a new tax on cars will actually lower their prices. I mean, if you believe that, there's a few bridges I think I've got to sell you around the country as well.
I mean, Nicholas, I always love this selective use of, because it happens overseas, it should happen here. Well, okay, the company tax rate in Singapore is what? Therefore it should happen here. The electric chair is available to certain criminals in certain parts of the country, so it should come here. No, let's talk about Australian policy, Australian conditions, and the island continent that we live in. Again, despite my annoyance at this, at how he's coming about this. If you want to buy an EV, good luck to you. At some point in my life, will I own an EV? Probably. But if Australians are making choices, they're making choices to buy big cars now, but also, Nicholas, you would know that the difference between a Ford Ranger that you buy today versus some clapped-out car that's still being registered that's 10 or 15 or 20 years old, that the real problem is the used car fleet, but the politics is that you wouldn't dare go after the emission standards of the used car fleet.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's a lot to unpack here, starting with that horrible beat-up by Matt Canavan and the Daily Telegraph. Now, at least in the case of the Daily Telegraph, we all know they've got newspapers.
Where's the modelling? Release the modelling.
They've got newspapers they've got to sell. So if the editor of the Daily Telly pulls out the beat-up stick, well, you know that's about the business. Whereas Matt there, I mean, he's just willingly misleading people. I mean, just look at some of the figures that are being bandied around. It's not a proper analysis.
So why is it wrong?
They're talking about the assumptions that go into the figures that were published in the Daily Telegraph today. Assume it's the 2023 model using the same powertrain and the 2023 vehicle with no improvements, extrapolated out to somewhere around 2030. Now, we all know the vehicles are going to improve between now and then, so it's a total misrepresentation of what's actually going to happen in the Australian automotive market. The second thing, of course, is that all that's happening here is we're moving ourselves in line with the US. Now, we all know that the US is the home of the gas guzzler, but even they have moved ahead of us when it comes to automotive fuel efficiency. And so all we're doing is catching up with the US, one of the world's biggest automakers, and bringing our market in line with them, which ultimately I think will be to the good of Australian consumers. And of course, the final point, which has been completely overlooked, including by you, Paul, that is if your car is more fuel efficient, you actually save money over the life of the use of the car. Whole of life cost, you save a hell of a lot more.
Hang on, as Ray
Can I run through the numbers?
If it goes up $25,000 and you're going to save $1,000, it's 25 years before it goes level. But Matt, we ran your tweet last night, so I know you know the numbers here. Go over them, right? Which is literally explain.
Go. So I'll pick the most popular car, Nick. These are the actual numbers, Nick. These are just the government's numbers. I'll pick the most popular car. The Ford Ranger last year, it emits 188 grams per kilometre of CO2. The government wants its standard to get down to 77 grams per kilowatt hour by 2029. So a big chunk, a big change, over 100 grams per kilometre. I get you're saying the car will become more efficient. I agree. The government assumes roughly a 1.5% improvement in efficiency each year. You factor that in, you get the Ford Ranger down to 168 grams per kilometre. It's still 90 grams per kilometre over the government's limit. The government's fine is $100 per gram over. And so $100 times 90 is $9,000. There's the sums, Nick. Like it's that simple. It takes a little bit of calculations, but that's where these numbers come from. The government won't release its own modelling. So we've asked for that in the Senate. They're refusing to release it because they're saying it's got to do with cabinet deliberations. If my figures are wrong, Nick, release the modelling. Chris Bowen, release all your modelling and show that my numbers are wrong. I've just walked you through my numbers. Where are they wrong? Tell me where I'm wrong.